If you think about it, the best place to hide secrets is in the open, where everyone can see them. But you must first convince everyone that these secrets actually represent something of lesser significance. In order for us to help you decode these secrets, you must first increase your knowledge of ancient Egypt. You must take a journey back in time, down the Nile, and rediscover knowledge that has long since been forgotten. So, sit back, relax, sharpen your eye, and tune your ear so you'll know what you see and understand what you hear.
It's another people. This has nothing to do with African culture or European culture. This is people to people. If you want to oppress a people, there are three things that you take from them. You take their history, you take their language, and you take their psychological factor. Their psychological factor are what we call VIPs. Dr. Leonard Jeffries calls them the values, the interests, and the principles of a people. Take those from them. Take their history, take their language, take their values, interests, and principles, and then superimpose your history, your language, your values, interests, and principles on them, and no matter what conclusion they come to in the challenge they face, they will always act in the interest of the oppressor that took their history, language, and their values, interests, and principles. So when we wonder why the choices we make never serve our best interests, you got to change the paradigm. You have to study your history. You have to study your language, your values, interests, and principles.
Our youth about that information.
Black history has been repressed in this country. That's why Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926 established Negro History Week in order to teach information that was not being taught in this country. That's why Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1933 wrote The Miseducation of the Negro, in which he showed that there was an intentional effort on the part of this government to miseducate people of African ancestry so that we would never know who we were. And as a consequence of being miseducated, we would never be able to access the power that lies in the truth of knowing who you are.
Astronomy from the Kemetic Africans. Black spark, white fire, Dion Chrysonomos points out in 30 AD, also point out the Egyptian priests mocked the Greeks because on many things they have never known the truth. What seems to be clear is that the Egyptian priests were regarded by the Greeks as the keepers of great astronomical wisdom. In the days of the 4th dynasty, the primitive Greeks would have appeared as barbarians and other Europeans as no more than cavemen by the sophisticated and technologically advanced Egyptians who built the pyramids. So here, that's why brothers still want to be a Greek, brand themselves, because we think that's the beginning. Now, in
the scramble to put Africa outside of history, they have made people investigate their history. And they have neglected their own writers who sustained the fact that great civilizations existed outside of Europe. The European was the last of the massive people of the world to come into that arena, marked civilization.
It's written about that. They recognize that the word of this Sophia wisdom doesn't make sense to our language. That's me. Their education will come from somewhere else. This is why one of the founders of the early church, Omer, he said that the best doctor in medicine, we found them in Kemet. The best doctor to heal you, to cure you, it came from Kemet, not from the best in the world. They came from Kemet. You find them in Kemet. The best doctor in medicine, you find them in Kemet. Next, you say, yes, this by Omer, this one, Thales, if time I will focus on him because he's the first philosopher, the first wise. There are 7 wise only in antiquity. This is the first wise, the first philosopher, the first scientist, the first. So we can see his CV. He came from where? From Princeton, from himself, from Dream, from where? So when you check, he's a CV, he's one of the Kemet students, the first student. Yes, and he went back, he built a school there, the first. So after, if you have time, we'll focus on him special, like I did in a book. Next. So let's go quick, all of them. This guy is, they have their picture too. This is a solo. One was, we give a law, the law giver in Kemet, Solo, Solon. Yeah, he give a law to Kemet, legislator, something like that. But he spent much of time in Kemet studying in Nocrates, in Sais Temple, and then Heliopolis, Iunu. You see, he studied there to give a law. Well, now they say the rule of law, the rule of the law. But the first people who give law in Western civilization, they were Kemet students. This is one of the first of them. Yes. Now they say the rule of law, they may spread the rule of law everywhere in the world. But they didn't start. They didn't start the rule of law. It was in Kemet. And this was a student who was in a Western civilization. Yes. You see? Now they pretend everything belongs to them. Now they give back to the world. You see? And these also, you see, all of them systematically, all of them. This one, Pythagoras. Of course, we know Pythagoras. There is no Pythagoras, you see. When the text said that when Plato learned that these people, they have their knowledge from Kemet, so he decided to go to Kemet himself. Yes. And he built a school. He is one of the genius in wisdom, in philosophy, in Sophia. But they didn't have the word Sophia. So he spent 22 years in Kemet to study. In Memphis, Mennefer, in Heliopolis, and Waset in Thebes too. And he stayed there. They say, I want to know this. I want to go to the temple. They say, no. You don't go to the temple. He say, why? Because you are not circumcised, you see. You must be circumcised so you can go. To go this place. He said, look, Dumutu, the first Greek in the world, in history, to be circumcised, this guy. Yes, the first. So he can go to the higher level, to do his PhD, we can say. You see?
Here's what they were saying, and at the end of the argument, in ancient Kemet, Egypt, which is the foreign name, the south and the north were always ethnically homogeneous. That's the first. They weren't debating that after the Cairo Symposium was over. This is in the minutes of the meeting. Professor Vercuter of Paris suggested that the population of Kemet was made up of black-skinned white people. And that suggestion was treated as trivia. Nobody picked up and defended him on that. Because, in other words, when you're looking at mummy after mummy, and image after image, and almost all of them are black, then if you want them to be white, you have to say white people are black people.
Brought forward and others. There is evidence, the migration, the movement of agriculture, every major plant in Egypt, at least half a dozen are found coming from the south. There's not a single plant that comes down to the south. This nonsense about civilization, that civilization in Egypt was created by Asiatics and Caucasoids, and then they brought the light of civilization down to the benighted black barbarians in the south. Not a single shred of evidence. The script comes up, the agriculture comes up, all the symbols comes up, the conceptions of God, and all the various forms that were to become deities in Egypt. It all comes from the south. The art, everything, you can see its origin in the south.
Same thing would have been true.
Okay.
Then this is bone evidence. There is a rule by one of the old Egyptologists and paleontologists that said that the typical Kemetic type was short arm and negrito, if you look at all the skeletal remains. Then the fifth...
we'll go to the next. I think we
can go to the next. This would be a slide of the from the tomb of Ramesses III, showing the two black figures in there, one is Kemetic and the other is Nubian, showing that there's no difference between the Kamite and the Nubian, but the other two are Asian and kind of European, and there is a pictured difference in that tomb between the Asians and Europeans, but not between the Egyptians and the Nubians. Okay, the fifth way that we know is that you can still check blood type in the skins of mummies. And so what you're looking for, if they were black, you're looking for blood type B. If they were white, you would be looking for blood type A. That work, to the extent that has been done, according to Cheikh Diop, shows that the Egyptians, even today, are mostly B.
Of Africa, that there was a greater expertise or technology or anything like that?
Based upon anthropological and archaeological finding, there have been very old period. For example, in Southern Africa, in Swaziland, there is a 43,000-year-old iron mine found there. So that would indicate, we're talking about 43,000 years, meaning that since we're dealing with historical record, it matches most of the things that we find along the line, and more specifically in Egypt, where we go back to the Sibyllian period. The Sibyllian, the first and second period in Egypt will be about 125,000 BC.
She represents. Now, the idea of the hour, that's an African concept. We invented that. The concept of time is an African concept. We invented that. So we've got the concept of numbers and algebra. We've now got the concept of time. And then when you put the two concepts together, you can then start mapping the heavens. And mapping the heavens gives you the notion of the year. Now, this is important because this is on the, what they call it, ceiling of a monument called the Temple of Dendera. And on the Temple of Dendera, let's look at some details we see here. Here we see what's clearly Sagittarius. See that? See this? Leo. See that? What else can we see? Two fishes. Pisces. Yes? And then we can then go on pointing out this or that, yeah? Now what's the really interesting one? This one right here. Yes? Cancer. But it's not a crab, it's a dung beetle. Because of course, Europe is what turned it into a crab because they don't have dung beetles. The fact that that's a dung beetle, proof, yes? Africans came up with this. And this concept here, the 12 signs of the zodiac becomes the 12 months of the year. And then later religions will turn it into the 12 tablets of Gilgamesh, which is what the Sumerians were running with. The 12 labors of Heracles is what the Greeks were running with, you follow me? And then certain religions then turn it into 12 tribes of this, 12 disciples of that. Are we feeling this? Yes. Right, then we have, you know the whole thing about us above, so below? Right, let me explain this. When Christopher Columbus was running up his mouth about having discovered the Americas, a Turkish admiral called Piri Reis realized then, as most of the Islamic world did, Columbus is a fraud. And my man didn't just say Columbus is a fraud, he proved Columbus is a fraud. And the way he did it is that he assembled maps that go all the way back to the Alexandrian period of Egypt. And then once he assembled those maps, he then published the composite map. Does that make sense? Now, can you see that's the coast of Africa? Where's this? That's Brazil, surely. Where's this? Mexico. These islands here, where are they? The Caribbean. So here we see South America, Brazil and so on, has already been mapped. Are we feeling this? Mexico and those places have already been mapped. Now you'll see that the map tears at this point, right? And then the research went to a cartographer at the University of New Hampshire. The cartographer's name was Professor Charles Hapgood. And then Hapgood and his students, they worked on this map to work out where was the geodetic center of the map. That makes sense? Because the map's torn. So you have to use what's there to work out where the center of the map would be. That make sense? Have a guess where the center of the map is. It is Africa. It's the Egyptian-Nubian border.
we have to look carefully. We have 28 days to teach the world's oldest history. We got 365 days to teach the youngest history in the world, and the oldest is 24 days. But they're saying to us, you all are great. You don't need 24. I think I'll go along with that. We are great, but we want our 365 that we're entitled to after all. We made the calendar. We made the calendar with 12 months of 30 days each and 1 month of 5 days still being used in Ethiopia today. The 13-month calendar. It is our geologists, our scientists, who made the world's first calendar when there was no Greece, no Rome, no Jesus, no Jehovah, no Allah, no Jew, no Gentile, no Christian. Our ancestors were on the Nile, first in the Grand Lodge of Saqqara, then in the Grand Lodge of what is today called Luxor. Originally we call it Waset. The Greeks came and changed the name to Thebes. We make the first calendar in 10,000 before the Common Era, revise it in 4100. It is that same year, 4100, when we gave the world the first Holy Scriptures. The Book of the Dead, the Book of the Dead, Budge call it, properly the Book of the Coming Forth by Day and by Night, the Book of the Gates, the admonitions to Goddess Ma'at. We gave to the world a symbol of justice, copied by the United States Supreme Court. No mention of it. They can't mention it because of the distortions they put it in. Instead of Ma'at holding a scale balance, she holds a scale upside down. It can't be justice. That is just this.
In Philadelphia, and it's called Renoko Live in Egypt. So this is just a brief synopsis of that. And then we can see this modern falsification of history. This is the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, and it really is a travesty. It doesn't even look right to me. But anyway, we move from this to this. Something's not right. But this is, I think, what most people imagine ancient Egypt looked like, or this of Egypt. Luxor is important because this is where 80% of all the monuments in ancient Egypt are located. And this is an image of God Amen, Amun, Aman, which means the invisible one, the unseen one, the hidden one. This is in my favorite museum in Africa, the Luxor Museum. And of course, this is the beautiful Queen Tai. This is the only image that I'm going to show in this sequence that is one of the few images that is not symbolic. This is natural. This is real. This one is in that same museum in Berlin, the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. This is Queen Tai, or T.A. Some people pronounce it Queen T, T-I-Y-E. She is the mother of Akhenaten and King Tut in her beautiful natural blackness. This is an image of her most famous son, but the least important of her offspring in all likelihood. This is Tutankhamun, or King Tut, and this is a black statue made of ebony, conveniently left out. You have to go to Egypt pretty much to see them. And then, of course, this image of an African queen from Dynasty 2021. Her name is Cairo Mama, and this image is in the Louvre, the National Museum in France. And you have two images here as we wind down our brief segment on Egypt. This is a sister whose name escapes me. This is another African queen from Egypt in Dynasty 2021. And you can see the remains of an African woman, not a mummy, but an African woman who has been mummified, the mummy unwrapped and photographed. Particularly the hair, I think, draws our interest here. And you can compare this image from antiquity, 3,000 years ago, to this image of today.
Yeah.
Herodotus spent 7 months in Egypt. He wasn't just talking about hearsay. He isn't talking about what he heard. He traveled from the Nile Delta all the way down to Syene, or the southern boundary of Egypt. 7 months. He went the entire length of the country. He saw those people. So he was talking as an eyewitness, not as somebody who was just repeating hearsay.
But they didn't do that. They could not, because at the time, they even called these people ignoble people, people uncouth. And they went about to shall I say, civilize them. But the same people that civilized, Professor Clark used a term, the guests, they invited the guests and they became the dinner for the guests. And so, but this is the whole thing. We must understand, I think too, the culture of the African, you know, Gil, if you got a home, you got your wife, your family, and you have a certain behavior pattern that you don't mistreat little children, you don't do this and that, and someone comes in, knock down your wife, take over your house.
He's a dead man.
He's a dead man today. But in those days, you didn't know. You believed that when you saw that man, you saw a man who come in with the same moral values that you have. You have no other point of reference that this can be, you don't know that this man gonna rape your wife because nobody rapes people in your place. You don't even have a word for rape.
A key element in dispelling a popular belief.
But the discovery of the tombs of the pyramid builders reconstruct history and tell us that the builders of the pyramids were Egyptians, and the builder of the pyramids were not slaves, and the builder of the pyramids were not slaves, and the builder of the pyramids were not slaves.
The fact that those who died during the construction were entombed so close to the pharaohs and the pyramids meant they were honored workers, not slaves. And they were honored workers, not slaves. They were honored workers, not slaves.
The Moors went into Spain in 711 and did not lose power in Spain until 1485. That was a period of 774 years that Africans ruled that section of Europe. The Africans went into what was called Pyrrhus, now today Greece, and built Pyrrhus' first center of learning called Delphi, the lodge at Delphi. From Plato, go earlier, from Homer, down to Aristotle, including Thales to Socrates. All of them came to Egypt and Nubia, or Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia to receive their education. Pythagoras, for example, said that when he came to receive his education on the Nile, he had to follow the custom of giving a silver goblet before he was circumcised and allowed to study. Not
just add scientific instruments. The obelisk could be used to determine the meridian for astronomical calculations and as an accurate shadow clock. An African-born mathematician named Eratosthenes used an obelisk in Kemet to determine the radius and circumference of the Earth. Here's how it could be done. By measuring the shadow of an obelisk of known height, the angle of the sun can be determined. Then, traveling a known distance and measuring when the sun is directly overhead as evidenced by the absence of shadow, suggests that proportion with which can be easily solved for the radius and circumference of the Earth. This milestone in history demonstrates that African technology was advanced and thorough enough to prove the Earth was round long before Columbus made his voyage.
What's interesting is to know that the upper province of Kemet was referred to as Chem. That's spelled C-H-E-M.
Okay, why don't we take a look at that? We have a map of that. Go ahead, Sam.
And that's the root of the word chemistry. So that's an indication to us that the sciences of the earth were first studied there in Africa.
Okay.
Medicine as well.
Right.
The ancient Kemites were known throughout the ancient world as the best of all doctors. Homer tells us that, as do many of the Greek historians.
The decision to place Egypt in the Middle East in the 20th century represents nothing more than an attempt to remove Egypt from Africa and the Nile Valley. If Egypt is in the Middle East, then where is the Middle West? Where is the Middle North and the Middle South? Even our perceptions of the geographical landmass of the earth have been distorted. The map of the world that we are most familiar with, the Mercator map, was created by a German cartographer in 1569. The map was designed for European navigators, and it places Europe in the center of their world. It also seriously distorts and misrepresents the true shapes and proportions of the land masses of the world in favor of Europe. The Mercator map shows the northern hemisphere, which is 18.9 million square miles, to be more than 2/3 of the land mass. It compresses the southern hemisphere, 38.6 million square miles, into the remaining 1/3. The Peters projection map, created in 1974, more accurately represents all land masses according to their relative size. While it does exhibit shape distortion of land areas, it is considered a small trade-off because all land masses are proportionally represented.
The first system of writing, the first system of government, the first system of language and laws, science, mathematics, and medicine also had their origins in Africa, and their origins in a civilization which reached its height in the nation that was called Kemet, now referred to today as Egypt. And Europeans had a need, had a desire to recreate as best they could the symbolic and architectural legacy of ancient Egypt. They had a desire because for hundreds of years they mistakenly believed that the Egyptians were white because they had been miseducated too. And so if you understand the true origins of ancient Kemet, understand its African origins, and with that understanding you can then move throughout the world and then claim those symbols that are part of your ancestors that have been appropriated by Europeans in order to try to make themselves something that they never were. And we should not allow anyone to misrepresent this symbol. It's also identified as a phallic symbol. This symbol, the meaning of this symbol it has multiple interpretations. And we have to be able to know which interpretation to apply at which particular time. And so this symbol did at one time represent the missing portion of a sar that his wife Aset did not find, his phallus, which was supposedly cut from his body and thrown into the Nile River and eaten by a catfish. But this symbol is a phallic symbol. A phallic symbol, a 555-foot high penis of an African that stands in the center of Washington, D.C. And if you understand that aspect of its history, maybe you can begin to understand why Bill Clinton can't keep his pants zipped up. See, the stuff works both ways. It works both ways. We also need to understand and be very clear of the mission of George Washington and the so-called founding fathers after they won their freedom from England and established this nation. We have to be very clear that the very first act that George Washington initiated was to pull together a team of men, a team of artists and researchers whose responsibility it was to design a symbol which was to represent the heart and soul of this newly developed nation. And so this team took 6 years to study, research, and design the symbol which became known as the Great Seal of the United States of America. So the artist in me asks you all to understand that when an artist is charged with something, a job of that importance, they don't take it lightly, because they know that their work is supposed to stand the test of time. And the men who were responsible for designing the symbol, the men who took 6 years to design the symbol, were very clear about what they were doing. So when you see these symbols, you have to understand that they represented George Washington and the so-called founding fathers' desire to recreate symbolically and spiritually the essence of ancient Kemet here in this country, the United States of America. Are there any pyramids in England, France, Germany, Russia, Nova Scotia, Scotland, Lithuania, Ireland? There were, at last count, 92 pyramids in Egypt, 15 pyramids in the Sudan, south of Egypt, a dozen pyramids in Ethiopia, south of the Sudan. The only place outside of the continent of Africa where you will find pyramids is right here in this hemisphere, in Mesoamerica, pyramids that were built by African people who navigated the Atlantic Ocean somewhere around 1000 BCE and brought with them knowledge of stone construction, concepts of God, calendar, astronomy, and mathematics, which they introduced to the indigenous people. So this symbol is a representation of the industrious nature of African people.
Civilization, like humanity, began in Africa. And it is in Egypt where we find evidence documenting this nation as one of the most significant civilizations in history. The country we now know as Egypt was founded in 3200 BCE, before the Common Era, and was originally called Kemet. The people of Kemet were lovers of knowledge. They built numerous temples of learning along the Nile, where they perfected the sciences of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Generations of social scientists developed systems of government, law, and religion which have influenced mankind for almost 6,000 years. These ancient people also studied the heavens, dividing the day into 24 hours and creating the earliest calendar of 365 1/4 days. The Step Pyramid was the first building ever constructed, and it still stands in the city of Saqqara. This 19-story skyscraper was built for King Zoser around 2600 BCE. It was designed by Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius. Less than 200 years later, Kemetic architects and engineers built 10 pyramids at the Giza Plateau. The most famous, the Great Pyramid, was built for King Khufu. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was comprised of nearly 4 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. This incredible monument was originally built to a height of 481 feet, that's 48 stories. From the time of its completion, in approximately 2500 BCE, until 1884 ACE, when the Washington Monument was completed, Khufu's pyramid was the tallest man-made object on Earth.
John Jackson.
They said that the earth was flat like a pancake out in the vastness of space,
with the sun and the moon and all the stars going around it. The ancient Egyptians in the Pyramid Age, 6,000 years ago, knew that the world was round. They knew that it went around the sun in 365 and 1/4 days. And their astronomers measured the earth, and they knew what the polar diameter was. They knew what the equatorial diameter was. They measured the circumference of the earth, and they calculated it so accurately until modern astronomers said their error was only 1 yard.
They don't even know how to deal with it. My wife and I were in Egypt this summer, and we were photographing the wigs because we discovered that the two major clues to establish the blackness of the early Egyptians is skin and hair. Skin, lucky, because they're the only people who preserved their skin. Europeans didn't. They didn't know how. Africans preserved bodies for thousands of years. We have a picture of an African princess, 3,000 years old. Her skin looks like if she was buried yesterday. The hair, the eye, the pupil of the eyes, the skin, the teeth. Can you imagine that? Some people lose their teeth by the time they're dead. She has her teeth 3,000 years later. You're not dealing with ordinary people. This was the period in the world when blacks had a chance to sit down and do some thinking. They had overpowered certain territories and they could control their destiny. They were not slaves of anyone. And they had a chance to do their science. And it's not an accident. They were far ahead of the rest of the world in astronomy, in mathematics, in mummification, in brain surgery, in a range of medical things. It's not miracles. They were involved in their science for a long time while other people were struggling. The European had not caught up with that. So that when the first European entered Africa and touched Egypt, when the Greek touched the Egyptians, they did not treat them with contempt. I want you to note that it's not automatic about white and black being enemies. The whites were stunned by the achievements of the blacks. And they were not only stunned, they stood in awe, so that even though they had defeated the armies which had been taxed by battles with the Asiatics and battles with all sorts of people, the Persians and so forth, when they came in and they overpowered them, they bowed down before their god. They took the black man Imhotep and worshipped him as a god. Many black women became goddesses for the whites. Isis, who was the goddess, who was the female representation of God, she was worshipped throughout Europe, a black woman. They didn't think any woman of their race had that nobility.
The architect responsible for the design of the step pyramid was a man named Imhotep. Imhotep was recorded in history as the world's first multi-genius. He is the prime minister to Zoser. He was a poet, a philosopher, a physician. He is considered to be the author of the world's oldest medical treatise ever written. It is a document that is now called the Edwin Smith Medical Papyrus. This book describes 48 different injuries to the head, to the face, to the neck, and the spinal column. It is held in high regard by members of the International College of Surgeons in Chicago, and it is noted for its accuracy and high scientific standard. So we have to be clear of what this symbol is and whose it is. Front of the Great Seal also speaks to this mission, this desire on the part of the so-called founding fathers to recreate symbolically the essence of ancient Kemet. So when you look at the front of the Great Seal, the so-called emblem of the United States of America, understand that symbol, but more importantly, understand the origins of that symbol. That symbol was copied from the national symbol of Kemet, which was a personification of Heru, the son of Asar and Set. Heru, the son of God. I understand also the philosophical and spiritual differences between these two symbols. The symbol of ancient Kemet, the symbol of Heru, shows him looking to his right, which symbolizes the future, shows him holding in each of his talons a symbol called a shin, which represents infinity. And above the shin is a symbol called the ankh, which represents life. And so our ancestors were talking about this process of achieving infinite life in the past and in the future. And they knew by understanding your past, by claiming your past, you can then determine what your future was going to be by infusing that information into your knowledge base today. A very simple, very basic, and very fundamental reality. And above his head was a symbol, the sun, which represented Heru, and also represented the creative force which is responsible for the development and the maintenance of all life here on planet Earth. Those who copied the symbol of Heru and created the symbol of the United States of America deviated from this African concept. They showed the eagle, which is a bird that was indigenous to the United States, holding in his claws two oppositional symbols. In the right talon, he holds an olive branch. In the left talon, he holds arrows, symbols of war and peace, which means then that he is always ready to go to war and maybe ask for peace while he can prepare himself to go to war again. All right? The history of this nation was founded in war. The history of this nation was founded in the destruction of the indigenous population, the rape and enslavement of African people, and the use of their labor to build what has become the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. But also inherent within this symbol is another language, language of numbers. A language of numbers which speaks to an unspoken way of seeing the universe and seeing and understanding your relationship to the universe. Numbers have meaning, just as letters have meaning when they're combined in a certain order to create words. Words, when strung together, create sentences. Sentences create paragraphs. Paragraphs create concepts and ideas which move and inspire humans. Numbers do the same thing. All right? Numbers do the same thing. So if you were to look at some numbers and understand what they mean, then they would change, that understanding would change the way that you look at everything around you. Because buildings, carvings, statues embody this knowledge of numbers, this science of numbers. For example, the number 1 has always been associated with God, the Creator. The number 2 represents man and woman who come from God. Number 3 represents the union of man and woman, which produces a child. All right, now understand the importance and the value of that fundamental reality. Children come through the union of men and women. Children don't come from 2 men or 2 women. That's Greek. That's Greek nonsense. Children don't come and should not come from men trying to play God and creating babies in test. I'll put this out here, but I guarantee you 100 years from now, humanity will look back on these test tube babies and realize that people were playing Frankenstein and creating monsters without souls. 100 years from now, people will look back and re-examine these scientific accomplishments. The number 4 is a number that symbolizes a cornerstone, a foundation, a base upon which something builds, upon which someone builds in order to position themselves to move forward. That's why Washington, D.C. Brother Jeffries in the house, my brother, Hotep. Brother Jeffries. That is the reason why the city of Washington, D.C., when it was designed, was originally designed to be in the shape of a square, 10 miles by 10 miles by 10 miles by 10 miles. This square, this 4-sided symbol, was to represent the cornerstone, the symbolic cornerstone for the establishment of this new nation here in this country. Everything has meaning, whether you are conscious of its meaning or not. The number 5 has always been associated with man. And the word man in this original context comes from the Sanskrit word which means mind. So the word man has no sexual connotation whatsoever. The word man means mind, just as the word woman means the womb that produces the mind. That is how minds are supposed to come into existence, through the female. Number 5 is associated with man, or the mind, because there are 5 basic parts on the human body. Head, 2 arms, 2 legs. Men have 5 fingers, 5 toes, and 5 senses. That's why the Washington Monument was designed to be 555 feet. The designers of that structure knew that in making it, they deviated from the original formula for designing Tekken. Tekken were always designed so that the capstone of the pyramidion was to be 1/10 of the length of the shaft. Following that formula, the Washington Monument should have been a total of 550 feet high, but they added 5 additional feet in order to incorporate this symbolism of the number 5 in this monument, and to reinforce the fact that this monument was built not to honor a czar, but to honor George Washington. Right? So all of this stuff is encoded in architecture and symbols that are all around you. And doing some research on the African origins of architecture and symbolism, I found some phenomenal things about New York City. Remember the prison in New York City that they tore down that used to be called the Tombs? I want someone in this room, matter of fact, let me just charge somebody in this room with the responsibility of finding and sending to me a photograph, an old photograph of the Tombs. Why? Because that building was originally designed with the facade of an ancient Egyptian temple. If you look at the old photographs of this building, you'll see the papyrus columns, the lotus columns. You'll see the winged sun disk. You'll see Kemet symbols all over that building. Why? Because 100 years ago, there was a movement within most cities in the United States to build prisons in the shape and with the design of ancient Kemetic temples. Why? Because it was in the Kemetic temples where the consciousness of man was reformed. Hence, reformatories and prisons were modeled after, superficially modeled after the temples in ancient Kemet. Okay? So, people have appropriated our knowledge, our history, and our symbols for thousands of years, empowered themselves with that knowledge, while at the same time telling us that Africa made no significant contribution to the development of humanity. They knew that if they could separate us from the power that exists within our very DNA, within our very genetic structure, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, if they could separate us from that knowledge, they could continue to control us. That's the only way they remain in power, through our denial of our true selves. Okay?